Well, I want to thank Westminster Institute for holding this event and Katie for inviting me to speak. And I want to thank everybody in the audience for taking time out of your day to educate yourselves on this important topic. I'm going to speak to you about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC, and its efforts to stifle all criticism of Islam-related topics. So first, who is the OIC? The OIC is the second largest international organization in the world, behind only the UN. It is the largest Islamic organization in the world, claiming to represent 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. It's comprised of 56 UN member states plus the Palestinian Authority, and they tend to vote together as a bloc in the UN. So they're arguably the largest voting bloc in the UN as a whole, and they're absolutely the largest voting bloc in the Human Rights Council, yet most people don't know who they are. Originally, they were called the Organization of Islamic Conference, if you want to Google more information about them, and in 2011, they changed their name to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Their mission, however, remains identical to what it was previously, so I'll let you decide whether or not they're cooperating, and if so, with whom. The OIC holds itself out as a moderate organization, but let's be clear about the true nature of the OIC. The OIC is an Islamist supremacist organization whose long-term vision is the worldwide implementation of Sharia law. Its top priorities are the supremacy of Islam and what's in the best interest of the Islamic Ummah. It is within this framework, through the lens of Sharia law, that all ideas set forth by the OIC must be analyzed. Currently, its immediate goal is the international criminalization of all speech which is critical of Islam, Islamic theocracies, Muslims, Sharia law, and even Islamic terrorism. Knowing this can't occur overnight, it introduces the language in a watered-down form, targeting UN bodies and EU parliaments in order to achieve its goals gradually and incrementally. Under the guise of sensitive speech, responsible speech, or politically correct speech, what the OIC really wants to do is to stifle your freedom of speech. The first resolution I'm going to discuss with you tonight is called Combating Defamation of Religions, or Defamation of Religions for short. Originally, this resolution was called Defamation of Islam, but when it failed to get sufficient support, they changed the name to Defamation of Religions. Still, in the text of the resolution, the only religion that's actually singled out by mention is Islam. The resolution makes numerous assumptions and asserts them as fact. For example, it asserts that Islam is wrongly associated with human rights violations, it's wrongly associated with religious persecution, it's wrongly associated with terrorism, and there's been undue backlash against Muslims ever since 9/11. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of defamation of religions, what it does is it takes an idea or a religion and gives it protection from criticism, as opposed to what we have in the American legal system, which is giving defamation protections to individuals or groups of individuals. So you have defamation of an idea or a religion versus defamation of people. Additionally, in the American legal system, in order for a comment to be defamatory, it has to be a false statement of fact. Truth is a defense. So, if you say something bad about someone, no matter how terrible it is, if it's true or mere opinion, it's not defamation. By stark contrast, the OIC's definition of defamation includes anything that sheds a negative light on Islam or Muslims, even if it's true and even if it's mere opinion. Taking that a step further, it also includes anything that violates Islamic blasphemy codes. For example, in Islam, it's prohibited to draw depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, even if you show him in a positive light. If you do that, that's blasphemy in Islam. And under the OIC's interpretation of this resolution, it would be defamation as well. And though the resolution is called Defamation of Religions, in the OIC's interpretation and implementation, it applies only to Islam. There is absolutely no reciprocity for anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, or anti-Israel hate speech. Indeed, the OIC supports Hamas, it supports Iran's nuclear program, and it rationalizes 9/11. For those of you unfamiliar with UN resolutions, they are not legally binding, but they do carry political significance. So, the more often a resolution is passed, the more weight is given to the ideas embodied in that resolution. If it's passed repeatedly or in numerous bodies, then it runs the risk of eventually being deemed customary international law. Were that to happen, countries that never signed on to the resolution would be pressured to adhere to it. This resolution was first introduced into what was called the Commission on Human Rights in 1999. Subsequently, it was introduced into the General Assembly in 2005. If you remember, the Human Rights Commission was deemed to be a sham at some point and totally folded in 2005. And in 2006, a new body popped back up called the Human Rights Council, or HRC, and it was introduced there as well. In fact, this resolution passed every single year in all three of those bodies subsequent to its initial introduction. In 2008 was the first year that this resolution was in jeopardy of not getting passed. But the OIC had launched a very aggressive Islamophobia campaign to ensure that it would. It held 2 Islamophobia summits, one going back as far as 2006 and one in 2008, where it established the existence of Islamophobia and asserted that they would have a zero tolerance for it. They said they were going to defend themselves against all free expression that they deemed to be Islamophobic, including hostile glances. And they were going to target cartoonists, film producers, reporters, and governments. They also unveiled their first OIC Observatory report. This consisted of 58 pages of real, claimed, or imagined incidences of Islamophobia. That report is now produced annually, and they also have a monthly bulletin on Islamophobia as well. And by the way, this report had a lot of incidents. When I got a copy of them, approximately half of the things listed in there were not bad things that non-Muslims were doing to Muslims. It was bad things that Muslims were doing to non-Muslims. So how can this be? If you understand that the OIC's definition of Islamophobia includes accurate reports, the veracity of which are not in dispute, so long as it sheds a negative light on Islam, then it makes sense. And by the way, the mainstream media often takes the statistics provided either by the OIC or CARE or other Islamophobia tracking organizations and repeats the statistics without checking into the nature of the claims. And the numbers alone can be quite alarming. I'm going to give you a few examples that I found. I think these were in the 2008 February monthly bulletin to show you the types of things that they are labeling Islamophobic. In 2008, in the country of Qatar, the first Christian church was erected. Muslims were protesting on the street, and Arabic papers were writing articles saying that Christians ought not have the right to build a house of worship in a Muslim-majority country. One of those articles was translated into English and republished. That republishing was Islamophobic. It's Islamophobic that Wikipedia refused to remove depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad from the English language website. And it's Islamophobic that the EU asked Iran to drop the death penalty for the crime of apostasy. As a result, the OIC repeatedly asserts that Islamophobia is one of the greatest threats to world peace and global security, rather than concluding that perhaps Islamophobia is the result of the actions taken by a radical Islamic movement around the globe. As a result of the OIC's victimhood campaign, because that's exactly what this was, the resolution passed yet again in 2008, although this time with a plurality. Shortly thereafter, the Human Rights Council passed a rule that said nobody can come before this body and, quote, judge or evaluate a religion, unquote. The International Humanist Ethical Union presented for consideration violence against women in some of the Muslim-majority countries. The issues they wanted to have addressed were stonings against women, female genital mutilation, forced marriages of little girls as young as age 9, and honor killings. They were told that these practices are permissible under Sharia law, and therefore they can't discuss it, because to do so would be to judge or evaluate a religion. Therefore, it appears that human rights violations, which are permissible under Sharia law, can no longer be discussed in the Human Rights Council, the body purportedly designed to address human rights. At a certain point, the U.S. State Department realized that this resolution had potentially dire consequences for freedom of speech. So in 2011, Hillary Clinton asked the OIC to draft an alternative resolution that would both retain freedom of expression and still address the OIC's concerns about alleged Islamophobia. The result was Resolution 1618 to combat intolerance based on religion or belief. This resolution was introduced and passed into the Human Rights Council in March of 2011. It was the first time in 12 years that the OIC did not introduce the defamation of religions resolution. Excuse me. Both the State Department and numerous Christian organizations fully supported this new resolution because they believed it was a paradigm shift, moving from protecting a religion to protecting religious people, minorities, specifically from discrimination and violence. So what's wrong with that? Well, let's see if that's really what was happening. This is the resolution you have in front of you. The resolution drops the language defamation of religions. It is not in that new resolution. Instead, it focuses on intolerance, discrimination, and violence based on religion or belief. But a lot of the language is still open to interpretation and therefore problematic. And unfortunately, I didn't have a copy beforehand to show you where it is. I'm going to focus only on 3 clauses, but hopefully you'll be able to find them. So first, I don't think this is the first one, so you might have to scroll down a little bit. But it discourages religious profiling. That should be in the first line of it. It discourages religious profiling for purposes of law enforcement. How does the resolution define religious profiling? It says, it is, quote, the invidious use of religion as a criterion for purposes of investigations, interrogations, searches, and questioning, unquote. So notice, it's not prohibiting the use of religion as the sole criterion. In other words, nobody's saying, oh, you're Muslim, let's lock you up, and that's what this resolution is prohibiting. This resolution is saying that you can't use religion as one factor on a list of other elements to consider. Second, now please pay attention to my language. It condemns, it should say in there condemns, the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence, unquote, and urges states to take effective action against it. So, advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to incitement to hostility, what's that? It sounds very similar to outlawing, or very close to outlawing hatred, which you might have noticed is an emotion. And also, this resolution attempts to internationalize the norms of free speech. So does the former one. Both resolutions want to internationalize the norms of free speech. So in America, we have the First Amendment. That governs our speech rules. Other sovereign countries have their own rules regarding speech. Both of these resolutions aspire to usurp those sovereign rules and replace them with one single rule across the board. Additionally, with that same phrase, the advocacy of religious hatred, well, what's going to constitute the advocacy of religious hatred? There's ample reason to believe that anything critical of anything related to Islam, which is, in other words, defamation of religions, because that's what they're calling defamation of religions, anything critical of Islam, that using their interpretation, any criticism of anything to do with Islam would be deemed the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to the condemned incitement. The third clause I want to draw to your attention, and this is the one that gets the most attention, is it calls for the criminalization of the incitement to imminent violence. So what's wrong with that? America has laws today that prohibit the incitement of imminent violence. As it turns out, the OIC has a totally different definition of the word incitement than we do here in America. We have what's called a content-based test, and the OIC wants to use what's called a consequence-based test. For example, if I tell all of you to get together tomorrow at 2 o'clock and go kill Joe, and then you go and do that, you will be responsible for murder, and I will be responsible for my comments, because the content of my language encouraged or incited the violence. That's a content-based test. That's what we have in America. But the OIC wants a consequence-based test. The example that they most frequently use is that of the Danish Cartoons. If you recall, in 2006, there was a series of depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Subsequently, riots ensued all across the Middle East and all across Europe. The Danish embassies were trashed, people were killed, and mayhem ensued. The OIC would say that those riots were the consequence of the cartoons. But I think you'll agree with me when I say that while they were subsequent, there was absolutely nothing consequent about them. There are numerous problems with the consequence test using that interpretation, as you can see. First, it's a retroactive definition. Your comment, cartoon, or film is totally legal until someone later on chooses to respond to it violently. And then retroactively, it was criminal for you to make that comment. Second, it shifts personal responsibility from the violent actor to the person who happens to make a film, cartoon, or comment that someone might find offensive. If you have the Judeo-Christian values of personal responsibility, where does the responsibility lie? Is it with the person who commits the violence, or is it with the person who happens to make a comment that someone might find offensive? Compare that to how Christians responded when they were presented with artwork of a cross and urine, or in the Brooklyn Museum when they had a painting of the Virgin Mary that had cow dung thrown on it. They didn't kill people and riot and cause property damage. They wrote letters to the editor, op-eds, and they contacted Mayor Giuliani asking him not to support the Brooklyn Museum with taxpayer dollars. But most importantly, you need to understand that by using the consequence test definition of incitement, that's the whole issue here, the definition of incitement. By using that definition, it has the effect of enforcing the concept of combating defamation of Islam, the very concept that this entire resolution was purportedly designed to defeat. So in other words, this resolution was supposed to replace that other resolution, but by the interpretations that the OIC is using, they are still clearly retaining their goal to combat defamation of Islam. So they've dropped the language of defamation of religions, but they have retained the same goal they had before. It's also important to note that according to the OIC, anybody who defames Islam is an Islamophobe. So in America, we tend to think of Islamophobia or intolerance very similar to racism, sexism, or some kind of bigotry. But in the OIC's definition, it means much more than that, because it would be anybody who violates Islamic blasphemy codes. So if you say something that's true, you're still an Islamophobe if you're saying something negative about Islam. So in combating, this resolution says it's to combat intolerance based on religion or belief. In combating intolerance or Islamophobia, pursuant to this resolution, you are not just protecting Muslims or people, you are protecting the ideology of Islam as well. In 2011, in July, Hillary Clinton attended a high-level diplomatic meeting in Istanbul, Turkey, on Islamophobia. There, she announced to the world that the State Department would host a meeting to move to implementation Resolution 1618 in order to make it a reality, despite the fact that there's absolutely nothing in the resolution that mandates this, and it's contrary to the norm of leaving UN resolutions in the realm of the theoretical. The implementation process became known as the Istanbul Process. Excuse me. By making this announcement, the US legitimized the OIC's positions and signaled to the free world that partnering with the OIC is not only acceptable, but perhaps even desirable. The EU had previously kept the OIC at arm's length, but following America's lead, it held the second Istanbul conference this past December. The third one is supposed to be scheduled in June in Geneva. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about what transpired at the State Department Istanbul conference. This conference was held in December of 2011 over a 3-day period. It consisted primarily of closed-door meetings, and approximately 30 countries and international organizations attended, including the OIC and the EU. The OIC made it very clear that its goal for the conference was to push for speech-restrictive measures on anything related to Islam. And one, Hillary Clinton said regarding the passage of the resolution that the passage shows, quote, "We have begun to overcome the false divide that pits religious sensitivities versus freedom of expression," unquote. But if the State Department really did have any concern about retaining free speech at the time of the drafting and the passage of the resolution, and I believe it did, then somehow by the time the conference came about, the entire focus moved to protecting religious minorities. More specifically, it focused on protecting Muslims in America and Muslims in the West, rather than focusing on the truly persecuted religious minorities in the OIC countries. What about the Coptic Christians in Egypt? What about the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan? What about the Baha'is in Iran? What about the Jews in Saudi Arabia, if there are any? That was not the focus. The focus was on protecting Muslims in the West, where they're obviously fairly free and equal. And while Hillary Clinton chose not to push for the enactment of speech-restrictive laws, such as European hate speech style laws, at least for this round, and she extolled the virtues of free speech, she also quickly followed it up by saying that the U.S., quote, "advocates for other measures to achieve the same results," unquote. Those other measures include interfaith dialogue and, quote, "the good old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming," unquote. Hillary Clinton seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the principles underlying the First Amendment. The First Amendment was designed to encourage robust political debate and to flesh out minority viewpoints. It wasn't intended for some people to use their free speech rights to tell other people to shut up, because that's a more effective means of silencing them than passing speech-restrictive laws. I assume that most of you in this audience support the notion of free speech. But even if you don't, is it the proper role of the State Department to use peer pressure and shaming to stifle the speech of Americans with whom it disagrees? I think not. Secretary Clinton says that she wants to bridge the divide that separates different faiths and different cultures. The problem is the bridge of tolerance flows in only one direction, toward the Islamization of the West and the ever-shrinking of free expression. I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of losing freedom in an incremental fashion. Many people believe that restrictions on freedom of speech will never occur in America because that we have the First Amendment. And certainly we will not lose our First Amendment freedoms tomorrow. But if you look around the globe and throughout history, you'll see that freedom is the exception. It's not the rule. And sometimes the loss of freedom occurs gradually and incrementally, not always in a violent coup. If the public is not made aware of the threat and cannot name it by name in order to address it in its early stages, by the time people wake up, it might be too late. So this is briefly how I see the process going. First, we have people saying we should have sensitive speech, responsible speech, or politically correct speech. And you'll hear the OIC talk very frequently about responsible speech, and free speech comes with duties, free speech comes with responsibility. And as a result, a lot of people here have been engaging in self-censorship. That's stage one. Stage two is governments and institutions, such as universities, issue speech-restrictive guidelines and policies. And a lot of people don't realize that we have that in our government today, and it's getting worse every year. For example, The FBI, the State Department, the National Counterterrorism Center have all issued memos to their national security and intelligence professionals discouraging them from using words such as jihad or Islamic terrorism. The National Security Strategy Memo, which is our country's guiding document for all of our national security policy, has completely deleted all mention of Islamic terrorism. Previously, that document said that militant Islam was the greatest ideological threat in the 21st century, but now all references to Islamist ideology are deleted. The Department of Homeland Security Advisory Committee, HSAC, has also made a concerted effort to say that national security professionals should focus on terrorist behavior and, quote, de-link it from the underlying ideology that motivates it. So in the last year, just so you know, all of our national security training manuals and programs have been completely rewritten to avoid any mention of Islamic terrorism. The next step is civil violations, and Canada is a good example of that. Canada has a constitution that supposedly affords it free speech. However, they also have human rights commissions in almost every province that on a regular and frequent basis issue fines for defaming Islam, even if you don't defame a person. And by the way, there's a push to start those in America as well. The final step is the criminalization of speech. And an example of that is the case of Geert Wilders. A lot of you might have followed the case of Dutch Member of Parliament Geert Wilders. He has very strong views on the ideology of Islam. He has said repeatedly that he has nothing against Muslims. He just doesn't like the ideology of Islam. Now, you may or may not agree with him, but this is the issue. Should he be put in jail for expressing his views on a religion or an ideology? Yet that is exactly the scenario that he faced when he was put on criminal trial while a member of parliament in order for expressing his opinion. After a long drawn-out trial, he was acquitted, and many people thought that was a victory for free speech. But they were wrong, because the process remains in place, and the mere prosecution sends a chilling effect to everybody else that they ought not express their views lest they wind up in a trial and have a different result. It's also interesting to note that the language in the Dutch Penal Code under which he was prosecuted was very similar language to the Resolution 1618 language. It was incitement to hatred language, letting you know that the language can be manipulated so that it's not just about true incitement and it's not just about discrimination or violence, but about expressing your views on Islam if they're negative. I'm going to give you a few examples of how the concept of combating defamation of Islam is being played out in everyday life today. I want to be clear, I am not saying that these examples are the direct result of the UN resolutions, and I am not saying they're the direct result of the OIC, because there are numerous Islamist organizations all fighting to protect Islam from defamation using different tactics. So these are just examples of how that concept is being played out. First, defamation of religions has a chilling effect on speech and authorship in all quarters of life, from the workplace to the public sphere. You can no longer criticize Islamic terrorism, Islamic persecution of religious minorities, or human rights violations committed in the name of Islam without being slapped with the label Islamophobe. In Europe, most countries have laws, some sort of hate speech laws, whether they're called denigrations of religions, incitement laws, hate speech laws, and all of them serve as proxies for blasphemy laws by providing deterrent punishments for saying something negative about Islam. In America, books or events with speakers, authors, or prayer leaders who want to address any of these issues are being canceled with increasing frequency, and even TV shows and films have been altered. Corporations are changing their products, their package designs, and their production procedures under pressure in order to address the so-called Islamic issue and make sure they don't defame Islam. And in some cases, due to fear of lawsuits, whether real or conjured up, employers are giving special preferences to Muslims, basically exempting them from the laws under which the rest of us have to live. Excuse me. If you're interested in that, you can Google what's going on in Minnesota with EEOC claims and care. The FBI, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and the National Counterterrorism Center have all rewritten their training material, as I indicated earlier, basically deleting all mention of Islamic terrorism. So, for example, the consultants who worked for some of these agencies for scores of years with very high ratings, who are there for the purpose of teaching intelligence professionals about terrorism, can no longer talk about Islamic terrorism because they're Islamophobes and they have been not invited back. In other words, our government, using your taxpayer dollars, is working hard to protect Islam from defamation at the expense of protecting you. And finally, just to show you how far the government's position has shifted over the years, years ago, there were a UN resolution that had language in it that with speech restrictive clauses, and we signed what's called a reservation. A reservation means that we're opting out of that clause. So we'll say we're signing on to this whole UN resolution except for that clause. Yet now we have the State Department spearheading the effort to implement language that's very similar to the language that the US previously disavowed. And in fact, just this past November, the State Department sent another representative to a seminar in Saudi Arabia. Oh, they didn't even bother calling it defamation of religions, on defamation of Islam, and we sent a representative. Finally, we have the Benghazi Fiasco. As you all know by now, the attacks in Benghazi were terrorist attacks committed by an al-Qaeda affiliate. They were not the spontaneous uprising the way the administration originally claimed. So there are numerous issues with this. One is, what were they covering up? What was the government covering up? Why were they covering it up? But also, why was condemning an obscure, low-budget, anti-Islam video the means of the cover-up? I believe it was to let the world know that America, too, is protecting Islam from defamation in order to appease the Muslim world. If you recall, in his Cairo speech in 2009, President Obama said, quote, "It is my job as President of the United States to fight negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they might be." Negative stereotypes of Islam, not Muslims, wherever they might be. And that's exactly what this administration is doing. The Founding Fathers drafted the First Amendment in part to protect offensive speech. The way to counter bad ideas is with good ideas. Instead of working with the OIC to restrict freedom of speech, America should be leading the charge to establish freedom of speech worldwide, equivalent to that of the United States Constitution's First Amendment. We should be condemning the persecution of religious minorities and the human rights violations committed by the OIC countries, including those of Saudi Arabia and Iran, even though right now what we're doing is capitulating to them. Above all, we have to understand that free speech constitutes a human right. Its restriction in the form of combating defamation of religions does not. It is a totally concocted idea that stands in direct opposition to real human rights. Only people should be afforded human rights. Ideas, policies, and religions ought not get protection of criticism. And I mention this because the OIC is trying to assert defamation of religions as a human right. And they want it to be recognized as an international human right. Additionally, it's important to note that the constitutional concept of religious freedom bears no resemblance whatever to the OIC's concept of combating defamation of religions. The constitutional concept of religious freedom is an individual right. It is the right of an individual to freely practice his faith. It is not the right of a religion to be free from criticism, because that's another thing the OIC does, is they try to conflate it with religious freedom. Resolutions like the ones I've discussed with you today harm free speech rights, they harm religious freedom rights, they harm human rights, they harm national security and terrorism prevention efforts. Yet, the OIC uses cries of Islamophobia as a tactic to gain sympathy and support for its anti-freedom measures. In conclusion, I want to say that we cannot allow the OIC to take the shield of religious freedom and use it as a sword of state censorship. America is the last bastion of freedom and the hope of all men living under tyranny and oppression. We should be holding ourselves up as a role model for freedom, equality, and human rights instead of exalting the Islamist enemies of freedom that constitute the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.